And I had students who were learning English who were being assessed in a language that they didn't even understand yet. So those students didn't hit mastery. And I remember a parent coming up to me saying, is our school a failing school because of those kids? and that stuck with me, man, because I was one of those kids. And while the school that I was working in, amazing school, we had to be honest about saying there are some students that, given the same experience, are still underperforming. We have to address that. It's here. The kids that were high performing got ignored. The kids that were well below the mastery level weren't given the attention that they needed. They focus on the bubble kids. And when you have a system that does that, you're missing an opportunity to make sure every kid grows and every kid reaches their potential.
Are you pretty familiar with, like, well, I'm sure you are, the No Child Left Behind and kind of the fallout from that?
Yeah.
My understanding is some of the critiques on that were initially people were saying, you know, the high accountability of No Child Left Behind and funding schools or allocating money to places that produce better results was going to be more positive. But then other people were saying there was the lack of support there and it just had some communities fall further behind.
Yeah.
What do you have? I guess what in an ideal world, let me back up a bit, I guess. Education is very frustrating to me because I feel like sometimes when I look at education, it feels like like police or criminal justice, right? Like if you ask a cop, how do you get people to do less crime? Well, by the time the cop is seeing them, like it's almost already over. I was incredibly lucky growing up in that I got to go to a private school, and you can look at the differences between private school education and public school education. But as somebody that's been through private school, you know, the teachers are more motivated and all of that sure. But man, if your parents are paying a little money to send you to a school, every student there is there to learn. And the parents are invested in their education, and the students are invested in their education. They have to be. And sometimes it feels bad because when I look at the education system, like if you get, I don't know if you've ever seen The Wire, I'm one of those guys that watch The Wire, and it's my favorite show. Yeah, but by the time the student gets to class, it's like 80% of the battle can already be won or lost. So going back to the No Child Left Behind, what do you think are like good types of accountability that can exist for schools that can like push teachers and educators forward and ones that don't just hamper their ability to deal with problem students? Yeah.
When that came through, I was starting as a school principal in 2003. And I'll give you a quick story. I was a school principal at a school that high performing school for the district. Right. We had a program for students who are learning English, a bilingual program in that school. And the way NCLB was written up, you know, if you have more than 20 students, I think it was 20 or 40 students of a subgroup that doesn't make mastery, that whole school is in need of improvement. And then, you know, the headlines would be failing school. Right. And I had students who were learning English who were being assessed in a language that they didn't even understand yet. So those students didn't hit mastery. And I remember a parent coming up to me saying, is our school a failing school because of those kids? and that stuck with me, man, because I was one of those kids when I was in elementary school. And that just is an example of what was inherently wrong with a system that's a one-size-fits-all. I'm a big believer in accountability as well. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to stuff like that. You know, Richard Elmore's work, the principle of reciprocity. For every ounce of support, I have to give you an ounce of accountability. Or Michael Fullen's work that says, you know, support and accountability are important, but you don't lead with accountability. You know, the wrong drivers. So for me, it's like, hold me accountable if there's support there to get me to where I need to go. And I think with NCLB, it led with accountability. It led with labeling. So it disincentivized working in urban schools where the students were struggling. Now, don't get me wrong, as a Latino, I loved some parts of it. I loved the fact that we're now disaggregating data based on race, economically disadvantaged students with disabilities. That to me was really important because what that did was say, look, we have a gap, an opportunity gap that we have to address. And while the school that I was working in, amazing school, we had to be honest about saying there are some students that, given the same experience, are still underperforming. We have to address that. So race and place should never be determinants of success. I think the one-size-fits-all thing, I think the negative attention that it put or the labeling that it put on schools that were doing twice the work. You mentioned you went to a private school. You probably didn't have the level of poverty that many of our public schools face. You probably didn't have students that were experiencing some of the similar trauma that many of our schools and kids in our public schools face. And a public school teacher has to work twice as hard. And I would argue they're twice as motivated. It's easier to go to an independent school and work getting paid and not deal with some of those issues. I got teachers that were feeding kids before it was a national program to feed kids. I got teachers that were serving as social workers, that were doing what they needed to do to make sure that these kids were able to, you know what I mean? And that's why I'll always fight for public education to be the great equalizer, right? So NCLB, what it did was, unfortunately, it put a spotlight on, one size doesn't fit all. And the backlash to it, I think, took away some of the things that I wish could have stayed, with higher standards, higher accountability. And then I would argue with accountability, it's good to have. We need to have it. But it needs to evolve too. We can't just base everything on one test. And what ended up happening through NCLB, in my opinion, is we reduced what we taught to what was going to be tested. And then there was a phenomenon that I'm going to introduce you to today. It's called bubble kids. Bubble kids. You ever hear of that?
No, but I did the ITBS, and I know the I'm guessing
the Scantron stuff, right?
The filling out the
well, bubble kids actually there was a phenomenon where when you're measuring students and labeling a school and determining funding and determining which principals get hired and fired, you're basing it on a mastery, the number of students that hit mastery, right? So there were students that were way over the mastery level. They're fine. And then there were students that were way, way below the mastery level. And then there were students that were on the bubble. The kids that were close to mastery. A lot of our schools just focused on the kids that were at the bubble.
Oh, okay.
So all the support and attention went to these kids here. The kids that were high performing got ignored. The kids that were well below the mastery level weren't given the attention that they needed. They focused on the bubble kids. And when you have a system that does that, you're missing an opportunity to make sure every kid grows and every kid reaches their potential. So I saw that from the field. I saw that as a practitioner. And I felt like, when we over rely on one accountability measure, we're hurting the system in a way that hurts more kids at the top and kids that are really, really struggling.
Do you think it's possible to push education for, in my mind, I usually break out like K through 12, I think is a lot different, higher education.
Yeah, it is.
Is it possible to push K through 12 like substantially forward in a positive direction without all of us kind of coming together and recognizing maybe the need for like a little bit more federal oversight? I know that's a scary phrase.
Yeah, I know. Well, my thing was when I was secretary, I'm like, look, don't think I don't have opinions as a fourth grade teacher now, walking into the Oval Office, giving the president advice on education as a school principal, right? As a first gen college student myself, I had a lot of opinions on what we could do federally, but I also knew, would I want Betsy DeVos doing something like that? Would I want the person following me that maybe had that's not good for the field to have a yo-yo effect, right? We're seeing it now. So for me, it was about strengthening states and giving school districts the opportunity to leverage what works best, right? So we need to know what's working in Florida. We need to know what's working in Tennessee to lift that up and say, hey, this is working. Michigan, what they're doing for college and career pathways should be something that every state should know about, right? So I think what the federal role should be is to highlight what's working in different parts of the country, invest in those promising practices across the country, but not necessarily hold a stick and say, if you don't do it the way I say you do it, we're gonna take your money away. Students lose in that scenario.
Mm-hmm. A quick, I guess, political pit stop. Something that I didn't really consider before. I had a friend that worked at the Kennedy Space Center down in Houston, and I never considered the significance until talking to him about how weird it is sometimes that you have these cabinet level secretaries that are in and out every 4 years.
Yeah.
And he was complaining that sometimes it's hard to get long-term investment or planning in a particular direction because you don't know if the next, cabinet leader is going to take you in a whole different direction. And sometimes it makes even private companies a little bit reluctant to invest because they're not sure where things are going.
Yeah. That's real. That's real. And I recognize that even while I was in the chair, right? That what I call the yo-yo effect.
Yeah.
Right? Look at higher ed right now. Like everything that they did to try to bring, make sure that their student body looks as beautifully diverse as our country is now being used to pull money away from them. Right? So I could see where there's a hesitation to jump on to things that the federal government is doing because it's not going to last long, which is why I think it's really important that we moving forward, we look at things that we can find some common ground on certain things in education. I've always felt education shouldn't be politicized for that reason. I know it sounds hokey, but it really, we should rise above that. And they're all of our kids, right? I'm not Secretary of Education just for the Democrat kids, right? If anything, I think the harm that's happening now is hurting red communities more.